All right, awesome. Well, thanks for being here at the Village Central Teaching. If you want to know more about us, what we're about, as we start, thevillageocn.com is our website. Gives you all sorts of background about us. I'm been teaching through the Politics of Jesus series that's been going on. Gosh, what is this now? The fourth or fifth teaching. If you missed some or want to just review some, we have a YouTube site or YouTube channel, I guess is the right way to say that. So the Village OCN, they're all stockpiled there. If you want to watch those, you're sure welcome to. You can get to the most recent one through our website, and then that'll, of course, let you sign up for the channel. So, as I said last week, and as I've said all along, the purpose of this series is not to tell you how to vote at all. The purpose, really, of this is my subversive motive and goal is really to get behind everything that's going on right now in our culture. If we're going to healthily and hopefully engage with this topic of politics, and especially in a very polarized culture right now, we're going to have to broaden our gaze and see beyond our mere cultural historical moment. And so we've looked at some things related to that, uh, especially starting last week. We looked at just some general principles about what politics is. What does the Bible say about government, the role of government? What are some principles maybe we could apply since we don't live under an empire, thankfully? You know, we live in a representative democracy or republic. So we looked at some of those principles in some earlier teachings, but then I thought it'd be helpful to get some examples of a person or people who engaged wisely in their political, their cultural, historical moment. And theirs was far worse, let's just put it that way, far worse than ours. Daniel and his three friends that we'll get to see in some later teachings, they were drug off into captivity. They were young, they were teenagers when they were drug off into captivity after probably watching their parents get killed right in front of them by the Babylonians. And in essence, these youngsters were paying for the failures of the preceding generation. So there's probably great potential for animosity between the younger generation and the older one. We see that happening all over our culture, for sure, both directions. So they were people too. They were hurting, experiencing great loss, and yet called to live in and engage at the highest level of politics in the Babylonian culture. So before I go any further, that's kind of a little background, fill us in. Let me pray, and then we'll get into today's teaching on a collision of worldviews, which is really what's going on in Daniel and what's really going on in our world behind the scenes. So God, thank you again. I'm really grateful for your word. It's so rich and specific, applicable, personal, uh, and yet also you speak and give us thoughts and categories to understand things on the highest macro level, in addition to engaging in our micro lives. And so, as we study this today, God, help us to take the next step with you, whatever that is. For each person in this room, it's going to be different, whether it's taking another step of obedience, following you, seeking to lead for you, or whether it's taking the next step of investigating whether you're really there, or whether it's something in between. Help us take the next step. We thank you that you want to have a relationship with us. You show us that because of creating us and also by sending Jesus for us. Amen. All right, so talking about Daniel, like I've mentioned, just a great book, period. Not to mention a great commentary or study on Daniel. John Lennox wrote a book called Against the Flow. So this quote's from that book. Lennox, again, he's a professor. I assume he may be emeritus professor. I'm not sure, but for years at least, was a professor at Oxford, mathematics and the philosophy of science, two incredibly smart things. And then he also has theological degrees as well. He debates the world's leading atheists. Many YouTube videos some of you've already seen from this guy. But he's also a heck of a writer, like super smart, but writes in a way that we can understand as well. So talking about Daniel, he says this, and talking about Daniel and his friends, what makes the story of their faith remarkable is that they did not simply continue the private devotion to God that they had developed in their homeland. It wasn't just a private, personal piety, pursuit of God, but they did pursue God personally, but they also maintained a high-profile public witness in a pluralistic society that became increasingly antagonistic to their faith. So what a great group to study in our cultural moment right now. I mean, no better group to study, no better book to study than Daniel, I think, as it relates to just engaging our culture, but specifically on this issue of how do we engage with politics and these cultural movements. So let's just read again, because we're going to go back through this text. There's so much in Daniel 1. The first time I taught it in 2017, I think I had like 4 or 5 teachings out of Daniel 1 alone. It is so thick and rich, and there's so much there that I think God wants to teach us. So it starts out this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. So again, like I said last time, this is ancient dating technique. They didn't use the year, they didn't use like November 1st, 2020. They dated things by kings, rulers, the year of those rulers' reigns, etc. So it's saying this is when it happened, you can date it, and it's within real history. This is not detached myth, unconnected from human reality. Jerusalem was what was laid siege to, and Jerusalem was constantly in the crosshairs of powerful empires. We'll just review this. Egypt conquered Jerusalem several times, and the Jews were constantly tempted to trust in Egypt. The Assyrians wanted control whenever they were the big dogs. They wanted control of Jerusalem. That's an image of Nebuchadnezzar ruling Babylon. There's the Greeks, when their empire was prospering, they wanted control of Jerusalem, Israel, that area, and the Romans did as well, and we see that in the New Testament a bunch. So they all wanted control, and Jerusalem was constantly at the crosshairs in ancient history, these empires coming through, trying to conquer, because just as you look geographically, if you wanted to expand your influence and get access to the riches of Egypt, or if Egypt wanted to get access to the riches of what we call the Middle East and on into now what's called Europe or off into Asia, you have to go through this area. It's a strategic crossroads. And so Jerusalem, or at least the northern kingdom of Israel, was conquered by Assyria in 722 BC. Babylonians conquered the Assyrians about a century later, so they took control. And then what we're reading about is Judah falling to Babylon in a long siege that eventually they were conquered. Verse 2, the Lord is the one who handed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, over to Nebuchadnezzar. Handed him over because he didn't heed, and his others with him in his society didn't heed God's warnings, didn't turn and trust in God. Instead, they had their hopes in Egypt, in politics. Really, this is very simply what they had their hopes in. Their hopes were in political maneuvering and alliances with Egypt, and that's what will get us what we want. Peace, prosperity, the life we've always wanted. So they placed their hopes in political power, Egypt, and God said, if you do that, you're going to pay for it. And I'm eventually, after centuries of patiently waiting, I'm just going to go ahead and let you be conquered so that hopefully you'll turn back to me and place your hope in me. So it's kind of interesting. Political hope or hope in God, ultimately, with our lives right there. Later on in verse 2, the Lord handed Jehoiakim over, and then along with him some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. I come back through all this. The king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking dudes, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, capable of serving in the king's palace, and to teach them the Chaldean. Chaldean is synonymous for Babylonian language and literature. So the Babylonian leaders were seeking to re-educate these, now I would say most certainly orphaned young men. Like I said last week, they're probably around 15 years old. Most of us in this room are older than that. All of us know that that's a young age to go through losing your family, losing your homeland, and then being taken to be political slaves, in essence, to the most powerful ruler in the world. The king assigned them, so in order to re-educate them, in order to try to change their worldview, the king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food, from the wine that he drank. Like I said last week, he took the same approach that almost everyone takes with high schoolers and college students. Food and drink free on the house. And people will show up for that. They were to be trained for 3 years. At the end of that time, they were to serve in the king's court. Among them, from the descendants of Judah, were our guys, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then verse 7, we didn't get here last week. This is really, really interesting. The other thing that this chief official did is he gave them other names, the ones we know them by, other than Daniel. He gave the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. Why did he give them other names? Well, because maybe it was easier for the Babylonians to pronounce, possibly. But really, names meant a lot in ancient Near Eastern cultures. In the ancient Near East, a new name almost always meant a new identity, and it meant a conversion, that you are changing to a different religion, worldview, what have you. And so this is part of the pressure that the Babylonians are putting on these young guys is, yeah, we're going to change your names, we're going to change your identity, and we want you to change your whole value and belief system. And we're going to take really good care of you, and we're going to train you in it so that then you can train others and lead others of your compatriots in that. So what's the worldview of Babylon? Babylon, we'll see later, it's used throughout the Bible really as referring to literal Babylon. In this case, this is literal Babylon we're studying today. But it's also used as a kind of a metaphor or just a general term used to refer to the view of the world's value system, the system of thought and values that's opposed to God. It's Babylon in Genesis and in Revelation. We'll see that. What is the worldview of Babylon? Any worldview, you've got to start with origins. How do they explain where everything came from? Why is there something and not nothing? Question of origins. Where did everything come from? Daniel and his friends believed that there was one true God. They've been trained in that from birth. The creator of heaven and earth. Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Babylonians, though, believed in many gods, and the history of their gods is recorded in their own creation epics, most famous of which is the Enuma Elish. Here's some quotes from this. I bet we haven't been reading from that lately, probably, unless you're in college and being forced to. When in the height, heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Apsu, who begat them, and Chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both. I will try to explain some of this, by the way. Their waters were mingled together, and no field was formed, no marsh was to be seen. When of the gods none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained, then were created the gods. Notice, then were created the gods in the midst of heaven. Lamu and Lahamu were called into being. Ages increased, etc., etc. This is what's called a theogony, which means a creation of the gods story. Then were created the gods. Let's go back. How were they created? Well, first there was primeval apsu, which what the heck is that? Well, for the sake of time, that's referring to eternal fresh water. So eternal fresh water. Substance, matter, fresh water that has existed eternally in the Babylonian uh, worldview. Chaos, known as Tiamat, which was chaotic salt water. And who begat them? Apsu, who begat them, and Tiamat, the mother of them both. Both of these gods that we're talking about. So the gods were essentially created out of the basic material of the universe. The basic argument of the Babylonian worldview there was initially a mysterious primeval soup, chaotically formed, and out of that matter formed the gods, and then eventually humanity in an ordered universe. For those who've thought much about this ought to sound somewhat familiar to some worldviews that exist today. But let's keep going. The ancient Greeks had very similar ideas, not just the Babylonians. Consider the following, which is pretty contemporary, 7th century BC, contemporary writing with the writing of Daniel, Hesiod's Theogony, story of how the gods were created. The race of venerable gods who rose from the beginning, whom the spacious heaven and earth produced. Ye muses, dwellers of the heavenly mount from the beginning, say, who first arose? First, chaos was, next, ample bosomed earth. Interesting thought there. So chaos existed first, coming from heaven and earth, pre-existent. The origin stories, we'll just put it this way, without going through all the ancient cultures. The origin stories of ancient peoples are all very similar. First existed matter, unformed, unorganized, and then out of that came the gods, and really everything then is kind of God, interconnected. Well, many modern atheists like Richard Dawkins and others who write a lot of books, they argue things like this to Christians, with John Lennox even in public debates. You're atheists with respect to Artemis, Baal, Diana, Wotan. I don't know who Wotan is. Should look him up, but I don't. Kind of cool name, though. Sounds like a superhero name almost. Zeus and thousands of other gods just like them, or just like we are. We just go one God more. You're not willing to doubt the existence of one God more, is the argument of Dawkins, Sam Harris, others. The real question is the God of the Bible just one God more? Is he on a level playing field with Wotan and the gang, the Wotan gang? Okay. All right, so here's the ancient philosophies. Here's the summary. Matter is eternal, and it existed before the gods. In the basic state, matter was a formless, unorganized, boundless chaos. Some god or mechanism or process imposed order and form on the basic stuff of the universe, and this process is what is meant by creation. And when they refer to creation, it's not creation out of nothing, which is what the Bible is referring to. God creating something from nothing other than himself. Even this God, like all the others, arose out of original matter and is part of the stuff, or one of the forces of the universe. Everything in the universe emanates out of this God or this process. And so in some sense, everything is God. So essentially, if you were to just take these things and not have any of this background I gave you, that this is from the Enuma Elish, Babylonian text or Greek text or whatever, if you were just to put the basic beliefs down and you're in a philosophy class or whatever, this is essentially naturalistic materialism. It's what many leading scientists hold to. Not all. It's essentially, so naturalistic. By that I mean there is only natural things. There is no super above the natural world. Matter and stuff is all that there really is. Materialism just is another kind of way of saying natural, but the material world is all that there is. There is no immaterial, there's no spiritual. That's a figment of your imagination through eons of evolution. So matter is what is eternal in the Babylonian worldview, in the Greek worldview, and in some of the most sophisticated naturalistic, materialistic presentations of why is everything the way it is in Dawkins' books, in college classrooms today. Matter is what is eternal. So if you hold that viewpoint, let's just tease it out a little bit. What beliefs naturally arise out of this worldview? You guys could answer this question because every single one of us has grown up steeped in naturalistic materialism. Even if you grew up in the church, etc., our surrounding culture just saturates us with messages of stuff is what matters. All that there really is that's really sure and certain is the material, natural world. So what beliefs come from this? Well, Daniel just amazingly has shown us, based off of the actions of Nebuchadnezzar, what they really value. So what do they get when they conquer the people? They make sure to get the most prized possessions of that land. So in the naturalistic, materialistic worldview, or the Babylonian worldview, same thing, stuff is highly prized. You give your life to it. You kill people for it. You conquer people for it. The king ordered his chief of court officials to bring some from the royal family and from the nobility. Notice he didn't say we made sure to get all the unknown poor kids. No, he said we want the highest ranking people, their kids, taken from their land. Social status is highly valued in this worldview. Young men, we not only want those from the royal family and from the nobility, we're going to have to weed it out a little bit more. So kill the ugly ones, and let's keep the ones without any physical defect, good-looking guys. So in this worldview, naturalistic materialism, or the Babylonian worldview, physical appearance is highly prized, worth investing great amounts of time and money and fretting and personal reflection over your physical appearance. Highly prized. Yeah, these men are also, in addition to being noble from the nobility and good looking, they're also to be suitable for instruction in all wisdom, etc., because we're going to train them in our views. And make no mistake, this worldview, the Babylonian one or the naturalism of our modern age, evangelism for this worldview is highly prized. We normally think of evangelism as like a Christian term or a religious term or whatever. just watch the ads that show up on whatever streaming service you're watching. Pay attention to the messages of whatever show you're watching on Netflix or whatever. Listen to the ads. If anybody in here actually listens to the radio, whatever comes on TV, what people around you long for and love, it's constant messages trying to convert us to this world view. Yeah, evangelism is valued. The king assigned them daily provisions, best food, best wine. Have that for 3 years in addition to your instructions. So in addition, luxurious living is highly prized in this value system. If all there is stuff, then the best life is having the best stuff and more of the best stuff than the other person has. Luxurious living is prized, it's promoted. Those are the successful people in the Babylonian worldview and the naturalistic one. And among these people who were taking were our guys Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I'll just use that to make this point. The young and those who come from the outside, who don't maybe naturally have this worldview, are under tremendous pressure. They're brainwashed into this worldview within a naturalistic Babylonian worldview. And then finally, this is such a key point. Again, the chief official gave them other names, and their names were changed. Why? Yeah, it was to make their names more pronounceable or whatever. But it was also like a prophecy. When you look at what each of these names really meant, which I didn't do it for today because of time, but it's kind of a prophecy that the chief official is giving to Daniel and his friends. It's like, if you embrace us, if you embrace our worldview, this is who you could become. Pay attention to the messages you're hearing all around. Pay attention to let's get it back to the politics of Jesus. Pay attention to the campaign promises. Vote for me, and this is who the nation could become. And I promise you, it is promises that are largely rooted, maybe not completely, but largely rooted in naturalistic, materialistic values and thinking. I haven't heard campaign promises saying, vote, I mean, people who've made it this far at least, vote for me and I will help you get in touch with your pride and cause you to start searching for God. Make you reflect on, who is Jesus of Nazareth? Yeah, that doesn't get you very far. And it won't. And Jesus said it never would. In this world, you're going to have trouble. Take heart, I've overcome the world. So it's all this relevant today. Good grief, Todd. You're reading from the Enuma Elish and Hesiod's Theogony and good what other stuff you're going to throw at us. Is it relevant today? Well, let's just let Mr. Lennox, Professor Lennox, whatever, I'll give him the highest title he can have. He deserves it. He's an awesome dude. He says this about everything I've just told you. He says this idea that mass energy is primitive, that the material world is what is primitive, is what is pre-existent, really. And all else derives from it. This idea is the essence of the materialistic reductionism that tries to dominate Western society. On this view, mass energy is the subject to the laws of nature. Wherever those laws of nature came from, a question that is easily forgotten and needs to be addressed by materialists. We already talked about that last week. Some can explain how gravity works, but not where it came from. It can explain what energy is, kind of, but not where it came from. Why does it function the way that it does? Things could be totally different than the way they are. Gravity doesn't have to be that way, but there's something that has created it to function the way it does. So on this view, mass energy is subject to the laws of nature, skip down past the parentheses, and must have the latent or built-in capacity to produce all that we see around us, including life, the human brain, the human mind, and the idea of God. Why must this material stuff have the ability to do that? Because on such a hypothesis, God himself does not exist. So you've got to explain, where does the idea of God come from? And of course, there's various explanations for that. Let me just critique the worldview a little bit more. Naturalistic scientists, philosophers, and authors reject the idea of God. Oftentimes, you'll read this or hear this because they say, you claim to believe in God, but to believe in God that's blind faith. That's a leap into the dark without any evidence. We form our belief system on evidence. Really? And then they turn around and ascribe creative ability to blind, unguided material powers. How did order come out of chaos when the second law of thermodynamics says the opposite is actually how things go? Don't answer that question very well. Well, they do this largely because they're trying to explain things. Most of them, I think, really are trying to explain things and make sense of reality. But they don't have any other explanation at their disposal because they've committed to the fact or their view that all there is the material world. They've committed to that before investigating the evidence. So they don't have anything else to rely upon. Naturalistic atheism today, and throughout all time, I would say that there's a claim constantly that it's based in science, it's rooted in science, it relies on science, etc. Science is awesome. by the way. They go on record for the 1,000th time, again, saying, I love science. Wasn't particularly good at it in school. That's why I just studied history. Uh, but science has produced some incredible things. Right now, we're enjoying the benefits of scientific study and inquiry. We have lights, we have electricity, we have air conditioning or heat, depending on what Kansas gives us today. We have televisions, we have PowerPoint, we have me being mic'd up, we have all sorts of stuff. We have jeans, blue jeans, really cool things. But a lot of these views do not find in that claim that naturalistic materialism is rooted in evidence solely is not true. In fact, listen to a naturalistic materialist say it in his own words. Harvard, we're not talking about, podunk you, adjunct professor or something. Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin, I don't know how you say his name, but anyway, he's quoted in Lennox's book. He says this, a very revealing self-disclosure. He says, it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, of the world that we can observe. So the institutions of science don't require us to only rely on materialism, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence. What does a priori mean? I've looked it up 4 or 5 times this week to make sure I got it close to right. I often think of it meaning as before the fact. Really what it means is a priori means a conclusion you've come to not because of observation, not because of evidence, but because it's just, it's like a given in a proof, if you remember that from algebra or geometry or wherever that comes up in our schooling. It's something that's given ahead of time to help you solve the proof, right? Prove the proof. So this is a priori things, or things that are accepted ahead of time, not because of evidence, but because it's a commitment that's made. So there is an evidence. He says, using or relying on material explanations for the world are forced by our choice ahead of time to adhere to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. Notice the underlined, obviously. That's why it's underlined. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. In other words, no matter whether they make sense or not, no matter whether this approach makes sense or not, we're committed to it. Moreover, that materialism that we're committed to is absolute. Why? Because we can't allow a divine foot in the door. Why? Be a good thing to ask him, actually. My guess is because that could blow up the whole belief system. It might actually provide some explanations that would prove highly uncomfortable to people who don't want to embrace the possibility, maybe even, of the existence of God. So again, just to make sure I'm on record and it's in the slides, science is a great gift and has provided many great gifts to the modern world. Definitely, love science. But science, in terms of what science actually is, being able to prove things based off of experimental observation, has no reliable ability to truly explain the origins of the universe. It's foundationally, fundamentally impossible. When science does attempt to explain origins, it's moving out of its depth. It's becoming something much different than science. No knock on science, but it's no longer science. It's what some call scientism. It's a belief system with a priori, before the fact, beliefs that they assert and they embrace, not because of evidence, but because it's what helps make sense of their worldview. And thus far, what I'm going to tell you, and I think you've already seen this, is scientism, not science, scientism hasn't been able to advance past the theories of the Babylonians from 2,700 years ago or more. Let's just take a look at it. Babylonian worldview versus the biblical worldview. Just substitute naturalistic worldview, atheistic worldview, if you will, versus the biblical worldview. Same. Matter is eternal, is one claim. The biblical worldview is that God is eternal. Matter was originally chaotic and somehow was ordered. Biblical worldview is that the physical world was created by God. Maybe he used a process that initially seems chaotic to us, whatever, but God created the world to operate on order with a purpose and a direction. The Babylonian worldview is a mysterious force, organized matter. Not much explanation for that. The biblical worldview is that God created. He organized all things. The Babylonian or materialistic worldview, everything that is just is. The fundamental question that every kid asks as soon as they're really thinking and starting to ask any questions is, where did all this come from? Why? They don't probably say it this way, but Mommy, Daddy, why is there something rather than nothing? It's just a simple question we all have. The Babylonian worldview actually hasn't answered it. Materialistic worldview, the highest realm of naturalistic science today, hasn't answered it satisfactorily. Creation has purpose in the biblical worldview. And there's nothing in the Babylonian view, nothing or nobody who stands outside creation. It's a self-contained environment and universe or multiverse, to buy into that. Biblical worldview, God stands outside creation and is not subject to creation. He's independent of it, but loves his creation generally and loves humanity specifically, uniquely, and it became one of us through Christ. In the Babylonian worldview, there's no reliable source of meaning for our lives. That's why we're at a place where we are in our culture right now, because we've, for a long time, bought into the Babylonian or materialistic worldview, and loss of reliable source of meaning leads to all sorts of things like depression, discouragement, various other things. And the biblical worldview is that God is the source of meaning. This idea that somehow it's freeing to choose your own meaning is a terrifying reality once you really try to embrace it for a while. Many of us can attest to that. God is a source of meaning in the biblical worldview. Well, as I said earlier, the Bible actually has a lot to say about the nature and the future of the worldview of Babylon. And that's kind of what I'm going to close with, is looking at that. And then we'll have some time for some comments and questions. All the way back in Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 10, Babylon's referred to for the first time. It says this, starting in verse 8, Cush fathered Nimrod, great name, who was the first powerful man on earth. He was a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a powerful hunter in the sight of the Lord. I love those statements in the Bible. It's like, yeah, you'd already said that, but thanks for the quote. His kingdom started with Babylon. Erech, Akkad, Calneh, whatever those places are, in the land of Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria and built Nineveh and various other places between Nineveh and the great city, Calah. So Babylon shows up. We got to understand what's going on here and what's tied to Babylon and the Babylonian worldview in the Bible. It's actually worth looking at, what does this name, this really weird name, mean? Nimrod. Nimrod, his name means, like I said, in the Bible, in ancient Near Eastern times, not just the Bible, names meant something. It described a person's identity or gave him a vision for what they could become. Nimrod meant rebellion, or we shall rebel. Not a great name. And here's what happens later on in Genesis 11. This is a famous story about the Tower of, popularly known, the Tower of Babel, but more accurately translated, more recent translations in Genesis, it's the Tower of Babylon. At one time, the whole earth had the same language and vocabulary. As people migrated from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make oven-fired bricks." They used brick for stone and asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." And this is what you are left with if you choose to be like Nimrod and be a rebel against God and choose to embrace a worldview that doesn't include him and it's rooted in no reliable source of meaning. Your only hope for meaning, if God is taken out of the picture, is whatever you create. And that's what humanity was trying to do for themselves. And so God scattered them. That's the fruit of the Babylonian worldview. That's the fruit of naturalistic, materialistic worldview of today. And let's read the last book of the Bible, Revelation. In Revelation 18, this is now it would be a prophecy, a prediction of what is to come, what is going to happen. In Babylon, we see here being used to refer to the great nation, the nations of the world, the powers of the world's value system, if you will, opposed to God. After this, the Apostle John says, "I saw another angel with great authority coming down from heaven, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. He cried in a mighty voice, 'It has fallen. Babylon the Great has fallen,'" referring to the world's value system that's dominated forever. "She has become a dwelling for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, and a haunt for every unclean and despicable beast. For all the nations have drunk the wine of her sexual immorality, which brings wrath. The kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown wealthy from her excessive luxury." Notice the values that people have made bargains with and embraced are all sensual, status, stuff related, which is the core of the value system of Babylon and of the world's system. Verse 11, "The merchants of the earth will also weep and mourn over her because no one buys their merchandise any longer." And their identity and hope is in selling stuff, making money. "Merchandise of gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls, fine fabrics of linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of fragrant wood products, objects of ivory, objects of expensive wood, brass, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, and incense, myrrh, and frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine wheat, flour, and grain, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and slaves and human lives." Everything you find valuable, they find valuable. It's going bye-bye because God's overthrowing the kingdom of the earth, Babylon, the values of a world opposed to God. Throughout the whole Bible and all of human history, the worldviews of Babylon and of God constantly collide. And so, as you engage in and think about politics and voting and whatever, do your part, vote, all those things. But if your ultimate hope and you find yourself getting too riled up over the political, whatever comes out of the political process, it might be an indication that your hopes are set too much on Babylon and not set enough on the King of the universe, who's still reigning and is going to come back again someday. So often, a lot of this, I know there's like, okay, so what's the practical step here? Practical step is that the way we think needs to be rewired. We need to fill our minds with God's truth. And if you don't believe in Christ, you need to investigate the evidence for that, have discussions about that, and counter to what many claim, Christianity is not based on blind faith at all. Christianity is based on evidence for real historical events where God became man, died for our sins, and rose again to defeat death and to give us the promise of eternal life. He did that through Jesus of Nazareth. So investigate that. And if you haven't already done so, pick up the free book in the back, Discovering God. It's a great starting point, at least, to investigate the evidence. So yeah, that's what Paul is talking about. What we need, what's really going on. We're in the middle of a war, a spiritual war. It's being waged for the minds and hearts of people. And this is how he describes it. A lot of times, so you hear the word spiritual warfare, and that typically introduces like, whoa, now we're in voodoo world. Uh, that's not how Paul describes it, not how the Bible describes it. He says, though we live in the body, we don't wage war in an unspiritual way. Since the weapons of our warfare are not worldly, but are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. So, what's he trying to demolish? What are the weapons there to do? They're to demolish arguments, every high minded thing, or every pretension, or every half truth that can be translated any of those ways, that is raised up against the knowledge of God, taking every thought captive to obey Christ. So the primary battle being waged is over how we think about God, reality, ourselves, and one another. And that's why I thought it was so important to go and look at the worldviews that lie, or the worldview that lies behind this system that is crying out for your allegiance and crying out for you. After next Tuesday, about half of the population is going to be pissed. Don't know which side. Actually, probably not half, because there's some that are going to be more level headed, but there's going to be some very boisterous, upset people, no matter what happens. And so, if you're going to be, if you find yourself in that group, I think that's a sign your hope is set on Babylon. It's okay to be disappointed. It's okay to have your opinions, all that stuff. But where is your hope? What strongholds of thought, what half truths do you need to see destroyed in your life, like Paul says here? Because if you don't take them on and destroy them, guess what they're going to do to you? They're going to destroy you. They're going to control you. They're going to control your ability to love people who are different than you. They're going to control your ability to dialogue with people who have different views than you. Control your ability to initiate, spend time cultivating relationship with people who you don't jive and connect with naturally. And we could keep going. What strongholds of thought, half-truths do you need to see destroyed before they destroy you? So that's what I've got. Fittingly, next week's topic, insights from Daniel, is what does wise and patient protest look like? Because that's what Daniel and his friends had to engage in as they really moved up the ranks in Babylonian society. They mastered the material, they passed the tests, they were at the top of their class, but they also had to protest different things in their society that they didn't agree with. And so, how did they do that? What did that look like? So, we'll study that. We've got quite a bit of time here at the end. So, if you have any questions on this teaching, not about political policies and various things, but on this teaching, questions or comments, just raise your hand and I'll call out to you. Try to keep it short so others have time to ask a question or make a comment, but also try to keep it short because I'm going to try to paraphrase it real quickly for the recording. So if there's long dead space, it's pretty awkward on YouTube. So any questions or comments on this teaching? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. 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 Great point, Tiffany. So yeah, the core of that point is keep all of us, no matter where we're at, with God, no matter how long maybe we've believed in Christ and followed him. There's always half truths that either are lurking or are buried down in there we're not aware of. So we need to do the work of continuing to pursue God ourselves, being teachable, letting him and others who are following him correct us where needed. And basically, I hear you saying just remain teachable and hungry for God personally. So that's good. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Heidi.
I was just thinking about how when you look at the screen and think about materialism and just like, oh, that is just so ridiculous that we get caught up in stuff and
Yeah.
stuff concept. It's easy to see that, and then I go home and I'm like, I like my stuff, and I like
Oh, yeah.
X, Y, Z, and so it was just a good reminder to me of like, left on my own, that's the stuff I want. Like that's what
Absolutely.
I'm driven to, and so I'm really grateful that we have community that we can keep each other accountable in that way and be
Yeah.
reminded of these things. And so I just reminded the importance of continuing to meet together and just pour into one another's lives to keep us each accountable in that. Because
Yeah.
yeah, left our sinful self, I like my stuff and my things and
Yeah.
be comfortable whatever the world
Right.
however the world finds out. So.
Yeah. So the summary there, I think, is a great point. Just we left to ourselves what we, I mean, this all makes sense. Hopefully, it makes some deal of sense anyway. That it seems ridiculous to really pursue material stuff that's going to go the way of the dodo. Uh, but then we go home and immediately we're drawn to our stuff. I mean, and I'm right there with you. Like, as soon as you said that, I envisioned my living room and my nice fireplace and all these things. It's like, my little slice of heaven. It's like, yeah, that's not worth living for. Um, so yeah, and it's, I think in addition to what you said there, Heidi, I'd say too, this is not an attack on people who don't believe in Christ or who do buy into a naturalistic, materialistic worldview. Uh, I'm trying to expose the faulty points in that and to get people to reconsider and examine that. But if that is your actual worldview, then it makes total sense that you should give your life to stuff, status, sensuality, something else that starts with S. Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, I don't believe that's foundational reality and the purpose of life, but it's hard for me not to pursue that, like just like you said. So yeah, why wouldn't people pursue that? That's why the foundational first most important question is there a God? Is there any evidence for his existence? Let's investigate that. And then connected very closely with that is who was Jesus of Nazareth? Clearly a historical figure, clearly outside of the Bible attested that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate, right in the time frame that the Bible says that he was crucified, and clearly his grave was empty. So who was that man? And what happened to that body? I mean, that's what's got to really, those are the starting points with people who don't yet believe. The starting point isn't, you shouldn't have bought that car, you idiot, you materialist. I mean, that's a terrible starting point, which a lot of people start there, and that might be why the church has a bad name a lot of times. So, other thoughts or questions, comments?
I think kind of the meaning of life, like the purpose of our life, with that, what do you end up with at the end of your life?
Mm-hmm.
Look at many people, and they have a ton of crap,
Mm-hmm.
but what did they do with their lives?
Yeah.
So giving that meaning, that purpose, helps us to live, in my opinion, a lot happier life.
Yeah.
So there's like you said, tested with that.
Yeah.
I believe that you tend to find you look at things a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. So, summary of that comment there, I think is totally right in the center of this whole thing. It's not only the argument, the evidence, all the things I've been talking about, but also when you embrace Christ and accept his grace, his mercy for you. You don't earn your way to God, but you accept that God accepts you if you accept him. It's that simple. Uh, and then that gives meaning to your life that the best stuff can't ever give it. Like, it's not only arguable and I think has better evidence supporting it, but part of the evidence is it works in real life. Like, it doesn't mean we have a perfect life. It doesn't mean we have a life actually full of difficulties. as believers, as just humans. But there's meaning. There's something beyond just this. Yeah, gives great purpose. Time for one or maybe two more. Anybody else have a comment? Question? Yes, Thomas.
As I mentioned, just that it seems to me like along these lines, so much, speaking of politics, especially in our time, is so much about envy.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, advertising is also about envy against all that
Stoking envy.
information,
Yep.
just plowing into our consciousness every second. And if only material stuff is all there is, well, then you absolutely should be envious.
Yeah.
That's all there is. You want as much as possible, and screw anyone else.
Right.
If you can have theirs. Anyway, so it's just, I think particularly
Yeah.
that you just see it operating in
Yeah.
political ads.
Yeah.
All the time, the creation of desire, like if we could have this.
Yeah. Yeah. So the big point there is in political ads or motivations or promises, but also just in our consumer society, the creation and stoking of sometimes invented desire, telling you should desire something you don't have, and then envy driving how we relate, how we think about others, people, which is, of course, how it should be if there's only stuff. But if there's more than stuff, maybe not. And actually, we should take a look because that envy is one of those things that destroys us big time. I think a lot of us know about that. Why don't we draw the line right there? I'll pray to close us out. And actually, I'm going to open it up, let a couple of you guys pray. We have time. And go ahead and pray, and I'll close when we're done praying.